Well, after months of speculation on what the next historical Total War content would be, we have finally narrowed the speculation down to a specific game and have a pretty good idea of what time period the DLC will be set into. The next historical DLC will be launching for Rome 2, probably in November, but maybe in December, and Creative Assembly released a pretty massive hint asking, is it the end of the Empire or the beginning? The first concept art we were shown many moons ago looked Germanic in origin, possibly from the Cherusci tribe, so my first inclination and guess was Arminius vs Germanicus in the aftermath of the Teutoburg Forest ambush, and I still think that's a possibility, but there's no guarantee it's even Germanic. It could just as easily be Gallic or something else, and given the hint with the Rome 2 logo literally fracturing and the idea that it might be the end of the Empire itself, I think there are some other options, ones that we haven't explored very much in detail. The year of the four emperors and Batavian revolt on the River Rhine in 70 AD could be an option, as the Romans experienced serious political upheaval and the devastating loss of two entire legions during this time period. Rise of Constantine and the Wars of Tetrarchy could also be a possibility as well, or what myself and a lot of people on Reddit seem to think is more likely is the crisis of the 3rd century, and that is what we're going to focus on for this video. In fact, it seemed like half of the comment section on Reddit were guessing 3rd century. It is entirely possible we missed the mark here and CA goes for another time period, but the crisis of the 3rd century makes a ton of sense for a multitude of reasons. For one, it is a very logical bridge between Rome 2 and Attila, a period of history CA has never covered before, but that wouldn't be incredibly challenging or expansive to implement. Just as it was a bridge between the peak of the Empire's power and the fall of the Western Roman Empire, it was also a transition period between classical antiquity and late antiquity, and like the setting of Total War Attila, it was a time in which a truly gigantic domain nearly collapsed under the combined effects of famine, hyperinflation, civil war, disease, and invasion. It marked Rome in ways that could make for a fantastic Total War DLC. So what is the crisis of the 3rd century? Why was it important? And what could it mean for Total War Rome 2, a game that hasn't had any new content released for it in years? Well, it all started with the assassination of then Emperor Severus Alexander in the year 235. As was common with massive empires that spanned the entirety of the Mediterranean, the borders were under constant assault and strain from rival factions, in particular Germanic peoples to the north and the Sassanid Empire in the far east. Severus Alexander attempted to pay off tribes in Germania so he could focus on keeping the breadbasket of the empire intact on the Nile River Delta and control Anatolia, which was the gateway to the Far East, but his troops thought him weak because of that, feeling that conquest along the Rhine was the only way to pacify the Germanic barbarians. They turned on him and killed him, kicking off a 50-year period of upheaval and disaster for the Romans. Climate change and rising sea levels forced tribal migrations that encroached on Roman borders, civilian outposts and cities were repeatedly sacked and razed, and a pandemic struck the heart of her territories, culminating in a plague that claimed 5,000 lives a day in Rome itself. In an echo of the second triumvirate under Caesar Augustus, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, although obviously under much different circumstances, the empire split into 3 competing states. The Gallic Empire, including Gaul and Britannia, led by Tetricus. In the west, the Palmyrene Empire, including Syria and Egypt, led by Queen Zenobia in the east, and the Roman Empire itself. No less than 26 Roman generals and high officials claimed the title of emperor and were accepted as legitimate by the Senate. So with the fragmenting of the nation, represented by the cracks in the Rome logo in CA's hint, the external invasions, famine, disease, and widespread misery, I think you're starting to get the picture here. All in all, it's beginning to sound quite a bit like the setting for Total War Attila, right? A very bleak slice of Roman history. Perhaps one of the most profound impacts of these external forces that were all pushing down on the empire from all sides were from an economic and trade standpoint, so some of that was actually internal as well. As the seat of the emperor changed rapidly from one usurper to another, each quickly had to raise money to pay for and take control of their legions. And the easiest way to take control of the military was to create more coin with which to pay the soldiers. So when you flood the economy with extra money that isn't backed by anything, you create inflation. And that's exactly what happened. The real value of local currency rapidly eroded and essentially became worthless, so people had to rely on goods and services or a barter system or turn to foreign currency that still held value. The internal trade structure of the empire also broke down in civil unrest, and barbarian incursions made the relative safety of travel in previous time periods suspect at best, and this meant that what was an interconnected domain that relied on trade from its many different regions that all flowed back into Rome itself became much more fractured and independent on a more local region, decentralized from the power centers in Rome and Asia Minor. So essentially, the crisis of the 3rd century was a hint at what would come later in the Dark Ages and as a part of feudal society. Information, trade, and knowledge would have a much more difficult time traveling from one part of the world to the other. After a very unstable 30 or so years, the Emperor Aurelian would bring the Palmyrene Empire back into the fold in the aftermath of the Battle of Emesa in modern Syria, and 2 years later defeated Emperor Tetricus I of the Gallic Empire at Chalon, reuniting the Roman territories and seeing his people through the worst of the crisis. Soon after, Emperor Diocletian would enact the massive reforms that would keep the Western Roman Empire alive for the next several hundred years, and the Eastern Roman Empire for the next millennia or so. There are a wealth of interesting characters during this time period if Creative Assembly does decide to go with the 3rd century crisis. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, who annexed the Roman breadbasket in Egypt and led a relatively tolerant, cultured, and educated empire during her brief reign. Emperor Aurelian, whose military campaigns reunited Rome and essentially stopped the bleeding of a disastrous 50 years. And Tetricus I of the Gallic Empire, who, like many of these so-called emperors of the time period, didn't last very long in power. Honestly, being emperor during any time period in Roman history was probably pretty terrifying. It seems like every 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 were assassinated, and an absolute crapload of them died violently in one way or another. And even great leaders were likely to receive a knife in the back. You can just ask Aurelian himself, who got stabbed a whole bunch of times as compensation for his efforts and for saving the empire during the crisis. So obviously the Palmyrene, Gallic, and Roman empires would be the main factions, with the Sassanids as a major eastern power probably playable. There might be some Germanic or Gallic horde tribes thrown in there as well, and in terms of features, I think it's pretty safe to say that horde factions will be making their way to Rome too for the first time, as this will almost guaranteed be a blend of Attila and Rome too, and factions like the Visigoths and Vandals were making their presence felt on the northern borders of the Danube and the Rhine at this time of history. I'm not sure I see the point of a family tree, to be honest. I know it's a feature a lot of people really love, but at best, if Crisis of the 3rd Century becomes the next Rome 2 DLC, we'll be getting maybe 2 generations of family, maybe. If we're starting in like 270 with the breakoff of the Gallic Empire, the campaign might only run 20 or 30 years, so you're gonna have your faction leader and his son and daughter, and that's pretty much it. Doesn't exactly make for an in-depth and interesting family tree in my opinion, but I don't know. We'll see how they do it. What I do want is a much more in-depth trait system, one that's more comparable to what Medieval 2 had, with a whole host of positive and negative traits that are actually logical. There are quite a few in Warhammer that make no sense. Sitting in a city to defend it shouldn't automatically make you lazy or corrupt. It needs to be a bit more complicated and nuanced than that, but it could provide a nice baseline. I will say, considering all of the reused assets and the framework that's already been laid out for them, CA will really have to kick this one into high gear with the polish and new features and mechanics and improvements to diplomacy if they want people to buy it. Rome 2 politics will need a big makeover, and features from Attila like siege escalation should make their way over as well. Civil War, as always, needs some additional love. It just isn't a time period that will make people cream their pants with the incredible unit variety or new toys to play with. The variation certainly isn't bad, but we've seen all these kind of units on this exact game before. Cataphracts and Roman legions, Germanic barbarians, that kind of thing. That's not going to move product in and of itself. The unit variety isn't what's going to do it. This is a perfect opportunity for CA to make some noticeable improvements to the core battle and campaign gameplay. And if they don't, I don't think this DLC, whether it's 3rd Century or Constantine or Arminius, will go over very well. And they kind of need it to go over well, right? Because they're doing this first and foremost to make money, obviously, but also to reassure historical fans that they haven't been forgotten. And if it's not worth the money in their first historical foray since Warhammer dropped, it's just not going to be a very good look for them. Honestly, there are some good features from Warhammer that could be ported over too. Skill trees that are more reserved than Warhammer's on the battlefield. Obviously, you won't be blasting away enemies with Wind of Death or solo killing 80 dudes with Zenobia or using magical abilities, but a skill tree that allows you to seriously customize a faction leader or general in terms of political or military bonuses would be really nice. one that allows you to kit out your general in a certain way that you want to play them. These have existed in some form in original Rome 2 as well, but they were often not very impactful, not a lot of choice, and you were pretty much limited in a lot of different ways. And Warhammer skill trees are much wider and deeper and more exciting to use and play with, and I think historical games could take notes from that. I'm betting that combat pacing will be very similar to Patch 15 Emperor Edition, so on the slower side of vanilla combat spanning the series, certainly slower than the frontal cavalry charge instant demolition of Attila, or the paper-thin armor and courage of soldiers in Shogun 2. If you remember, Shogun 2 had some pretty janky morale, I'm not gonna lie about that. I can pretty much already guarantee CA will stick with the god-awful map system they had in both Rome 2 and Attila, which I'm really not a big fan of. I really hope CA never goes back to that system in another future game ever again. Custom hand-built maps will always be better. They'll always be more interesting, more fun to play than the generated grid system used in Rome 2 and Attila. It just makes for dull battles. I found that all the Rome 2 and Attila maps, when you use that grid system, they just look like rolling hills and plains with some forest, and they all just kind of blend together. You don't know which one's which, and the very few good ones are sites we have to find ourselves. It's gross. I don't like it. Custom built maps are always going to be better, so I hope they stick with what they did with Warhammer in that front and custom make them as we go forward. The best maps they ever had for the game in the entire series were for Napoleon and Shogun 2, and those were all custom built maps, so that's all I gotta say about that. But anyway, no matter what the next DLC is, there's no question I'm going to be covering it on Milk and Cookies Total War. Definitely doing some multiplayer and maybe doing some campaign gameplay for it. Don't know about full playthroughs or anything, but first off, let's see what it is. Let me know what you think it will be. Do you think it's going to be Crisis of the 3rd Century, or do you have another theory based on the hints and information available to us? What would you like most to see in terms of new features? Let me know in the comment section below. Thank you all for watching. Indie Pride, signing out for now.